June 19, 1944, 10:28 in the morning. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vasu pushed his throttle forward and felt his heart slam against his chest. Through his oil-smeared windshield, he counted them. 20, 30, 40. More than 50 Japanese aircraft were flying directly toward the American fleet, and his Hellcat was falling apart around him. His supercharger was stuck in low blower, robbing his engine of power at altitude. Oil was misting across his canopy, smearing his vision. The wingfold lock pins on his fighter were only partially engaged from the rushed launch. Any violent maneuver risked his wings folding upward, dropping him into the sea like a stone. His radio crackled with urgent calls from other pilots. Japanese aircraft everywhere. More contacts appearing on radar every minute. The largest air battle of the Pacific War was unfolding around him, and he was flying a crippled machine. And yet, somewhere in the chaos of that moment, Vasu made a decision that would echo through history. He pressed the attack anyway. What happened next would become one of the most legendary individual performances in the history of aerial combat. In just 8 minutes, flying a malfunctioning aircraft against impossible odds, Alexander Vasu would shoot down 6 Japanese dive bombers using only 360 rounds of ammunition. That is roughly 60 bullets per kill. A display of marksmanship so precise that even veteran pilots struggled to believe it. When he landed back on the carrier Lexington, he climbed out of his cockpit, looked up at Admiral Mark Mitcher watching from the bridge, and held up 6 fingers with a grin that would be captured in one of World War II's most iconic photographs. But Vasu's remarkable feat was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of destruction that unfolded that day. By the time the sun set on June 19th, American pilots had shot down more than 350 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. 2 Japanese fleet carriers lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, torpedoed by American submarines lurking beneath the waves. The Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct carrier aviation, the capability that had devastated Pearl Harbor and conquered half the Pacific, had been destroyed forever in a single afternoon. The American pilots had a name for what happened that day. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This is the story of the most lopsided carrier battle in history. A day when superior technology, ruthless training, and individual heroism combined to deliver a victory so complete that it changed the course of the Second World War. It is a story of the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a fighter aircraft specifically designed to do one thing above all else: kill the Japanese Zero. And it is a story of the men who flew that aircraft into the most intense aerial combat the world had ever seen. The Hellcat was not born from abstract engineering theory. It was born from blood. After the disaster at Pearl Harbor, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, threw every resource into designing a fighter that could defeat the Zero. Engineers worked directly with combat-experienced pilots who had faced the Japanese fighter and survived. They studied every report from the early battles of the Pacific War. They analyzed every engagement, every maneuver, and every tactic the Japanese had employed. Then, in June of 1942, they received an extraordinary gift. A Japanese A-6M0 had crash-landed in a bog in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. Its pilot had been killed by a single rifle bullet from a ground defender during a strafing run, and the aircraft had flipped over on landing but remained largely intact. American forces recovered the Zero and shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California, where test pilots flew it extensively against every American fighter then in service. The tests revealed everything. They exposed exactly how the Zero achieved its legendary maneuverability and exactly where it was vulnerable. The Zero could outturn any American fighter at low speeds. Its climb rate in the early years of the war was superior to anything the Americans possessed. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly, drawing American aircraft into turning fights where the Zero dominated. But the tests also revealed critical weaknesses. Above 260 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became almost immovable because it lacked hydraulic boosting. At high speeds, rolling the aircraft required enormous physical strength. This meant that any American pilot who maintained speed could outroll a Zero and escape pursuit with a diving turn that the Japanese pilot simply could not follow. More importantly, the Zero had almost no protection for the pilot or the fuel tanks. Carried no armor. The fuel tanks had no self-sealing capability. A single incendiary round in the right place would ignite the aviation fuel and turn the aircraft into a fireball. Japanese pilots burned to death in their cockpits or exploded in midair with horrifying regularity when faced with the concentrated firepower of American fighters. The Hellcat was designed to exploit every one of these weaknesses. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, the Hellcat could reach 380 miles per hour at 23,400 feet, the later F6F 5 variant. Entering service in 1944, could produce 2,200 horsepower with water injection and reach even higher speeds in emergency situations. The Hellcat climbed at nearly 3,000 feet per minute and could reach a service ceiling of 37,300 feet, higher than most Japanese aircraft could operate effectively. The Hellcat weighed over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, roughly double the weight of a Zero. But that weight was spent on things that would keep pilots alive. 212 pounds of steel armor protected the cockpit. Armor plates sat behind the pilot's seat, absorbing bullets and shell fragments that would otherwise kill the man inside. Additional armor protected the nose and oil systems, preventing the engine failures that could doom a pilot hundreds of miles from any friendly base. Armor behind the instrument panel protected the pilot from frontal attacks. A bullet-resistant windshield covered the front, capable of stopping machine gun rounds that would otherwise go straight through the pilot's face. The 250 gallons fuel tank used a revolutionary self-sealing design. Internal rubber bladders lined the tank. When a bullet punctured the tank wall, the rubber would contact the leaking fuel and swell, sealing the hole. Aircraft that would have exploded in flames now kept flying. Pilots who would have burned to death returned home safely. The Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. These were the same heavy machine guns used by American bombers and ground forces, proven reliable and devastatingly effective. At close range, those 6 guns could put out a withering volume of fire that would tear through an unarmored Zero in seconds. The convergence point, where all 6 streams of bullets intersected, created a zone of destruction that Japanese aircraft could not survive. American tactical doctrine evolved to match the aircraft's strengths. The rules were simple and drummed into every Navy pilot who flew the Hellcat. Never dogfight a Zero in a turning contest. You will lose. Use altitude advantage whenever possible. Height means energy. Energy means life. Dive to attack using gravity to build speed. Fire in short, controlled bursts, then zoom climb away before the Zero can respond. Above 260 miles per hour, where the Zero's controls froze up, the Hellcat remained responsive and deadly. Execute rolling maneuvers at high speed. The Zero cannot follow. If a Zero gets on your tail, dive and roll. Build speed. He cannot match you in a high-speed rolling dive. The energy tactics that would later define jet combat in Korea and Vietnam were perfected in the Pacific skies by Hellcat pilots who understood that survival meant never fighting on the enemy's terms. The Thatch Weave, a defensive formation developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch for the inferior F4F Wildcat, evolved into an aggressive offensive tactic with the superior Hellcat. Pairs of Hellcats would weave back and forth, each pilot protecting his wingman's tail while setting up shots on any Zero that tried to pursue. What had been a survival technique became a killing technique. By 1944, the results were undeniable. The F6F Hellcat would achieve an overall wartime kill ratio of 19-1. That means 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. It would account for 75% of all United States Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. An astonishing dominance for a single aircraft type. And it would produce 307 Navy aces, men who scored 5 or more aerial victories. But the Hellcat's technological dominance was only part of the equation. The other part was the catastrophic collapse of Japanese pilot training. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators were among the finest in the world. The men who attacked Pearl Harbor represented years of careful selection and rigorous preparation. They averaged roughly 700 hours of flight time before reaching the fleet. By comparison, many American pilots in 1941 had fewer than 300 hours when they were thrown into combat. The Japanese training system was designed for quality over quantity. Instructors washed out any candidate who showed the slightest weakness. Only the best of the best survived to reach operational squadrons. The pilots who sank the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya, who devastated the American, British, Dutch, and Australian fleets in the opening months of the war, who conquered half the Pacific in 6 months. These men were aviation elite. They knew their aircraft intimately. They had practiced their tactics for years. They were confident, aggressive, and deadly. But the Japanese training system had a fatal flaw. It was never designed to replace heavy losses. The losses came at Coral Sea in May of 1942, where Japanese carrier aviation suffered its first setback. They came at Midway in June of 1942, where 110 of Japan's best carrier pilots were killed in a single day when 4 fleet carriers were sunk. They came in the grinding air battles over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands throughout 1942 and 1943, where experienced pilots were fed into the meat grinder of daily combat until they died or broke down from exhaustion. Japan could build new aircraft. The factories were working around the clock. What Japan could not do was replace the men who flew them. The American training system was the opposite of the Japanese model. It was designed to produce competent pilots in quantity. Washing out was difficult. Support systems helped struggling students improve. And when the war began, the program expanded massively. The United States trained roughly 193,400 pilots during the war. Japan trained only 46,000. By June of 1944, the training disparity had become a chasm. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet carried approximately 450 aircraft on 9 carriers. These were Japan's last carrier aviators, the remnants of a force that had once ruled the Pacific skies. Ozawa knew they were undertrained. He knew many could barely take off and land safely on a carrier deck. But he had no choice. Operation Ago demanded a decisive battle, and these pilots were all he had. Carrier Division 1, the best of Ozawa's force, included pilots who averaged only 6 months of training. Carrier Division 2's pilots averaged just 2 months. Some had as few as 3 months of total flight experience before being sent into combat. They had practiced formation flying. They had dropped practice torpedoes, but they had never faced enemy fighters. They had never dealt with anti-aircraft fire. They had never experienced the terror and chaos of real combat. On the other side, American pilots received a minimum of 2 years of training before fleet assignment. They logged 300 to 500 flight hours before ever seeing a carrier deck. They practiced gunnery until they could hit a target in their sleep. They flew mock dogfights against instructors who simulated Japanese tactics. And many of the pilots waiting aboard Task Force 58's carriers had already seen combat. They had survived. They had learned. The stage was set for slaughter. The Mariana Islands, a chain of small volcanic islands stretching across the western Pacific, held the key to the endgame of the Pacific War. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam sat 1,200 nautical miles south of Tokyo. Their capture would place American B-29 Superfortress bombers within striking range of the Japanese home islands. Every city in Japan would become a target. The war would come home. The Marianas would also sever Japan's sea routes to the southern resource areas. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, tin, tungsten, rice. The empire depended on ships carrying these materials through waters that would become hunting grounds for American submarines and aircraft based on the captured islands. The strategic importance was obvious to both sides. On June 15, 1944, 70,000 American Marines and Army soldiers stormed the beaches of Saipan. The invasion was the largest amphibious operation yet conducted in the Pacific, involving hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and enough supplies to sustain a prolonged campaign against determined Japanese defenders. The Japanese response was Operation Ago. Admiral Mineichi Koga had developed the original plan before his death in a plane crash on March 31, 1944. The plan called for a decisive fleet action that would destroy American carrier strength and turn the tide of the war. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice with the fate of the empire at stake. But Japanese strategic planners believed they had no choice. If the Marianas fell, Japan's position would become hopeless. Better to risk everything in battle than to accept slow strangulation. The original plan documents were recovered from a crashed Japanese aircraft near Cebu in the Philippines by Filipino guerrillas loyal to the American cause. They forwarded the papers to General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence staff, who analyzed them and forwarded copies to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Copies reached Admiral Mitcher's flagship at sea. The Americans knew what was coming. Operation Ego called for approximately 500 land-based aircraft under Vice Admiral Kakuta to attack the American fleet first, destroying roughly one-third of American carrier strength before Ozawa's mobile fleet engaged. With American fighter strength depleted, Ozawa would then strike from beyond American aircraft range. Japanese carrier aircraft could fly farther than their American counterparts because they carried less armor and less ammunition. Ozawa planned to exploit this range advantage by launching strikes from positions the Americans could not reach. His aircraft would hit the American fleet, then fly to airfields on Guam and Rota to refuel and rearm. They would shuttle between carriers and islands, hitting the Americans multiple times while remaining beyond retaliation. It was an elegant plan. It might even have worked against a less prepared enemy. But the plan had fatal flaws that would become apparent only in battle. American pre-invasion airstrikes from June 11th through 15th had already devastated Kakuta's land-based aircraft. Fighter sweeps from Task Force 58's carriers caught Japanese planes on the ground and in the air, destroying them by the score. By the time Ozawa sortied from his anchorage in the Philippines, most of Kakuta's 500 aircraft had been destroyed. But Kakuta never informed Ozawa. Whether through shame, confusion, or a breakdown in communications, the truth never reached the fleet commander. Ozawa sailed into battle believing he still had roughly 100 operational shore-based planes waiting to support him. He had almost none. His entire operational plan was based on assets that no longer existed. The crude oil from Borneo that fueled Japanese carriers presented another danger. Unlike refined aviation fuel, Borneo crude contained volatile compounds that created explosive naphtha vapors in fuel systems. Proper handling procedures could minimize the risk, but proper handling took time and experience. One spark in the wrong place could destroy a ship, and the pilots tasked with executing Operation Ego were catastrophically undertrained for the mission ahead. Opposing Ozawa was the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the history of the world. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 comprised 15 carriers. 7 were fast fleet carriers, Essex-class giants capable of carrying more than 80 aircraft each. 8 were light carriers, Independence-class conversions built on cruiser hulls, each carrying approximately 30 aircraft. Together they embarked roughly 900 aircraft, fighters and bombers and torpedo planes, more aviation strength than the entire Japanese Navy possessed. 7 fast battleships provided additional anti-aircraft firepower and stood ready to engage any Japanese surface ships that broke through. 21 cruisers added their guns to the defensive screen. 69 destroyers formed an outer ring of protection, hunting submarines and rescuing downed pilots. All of this fell under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet. Spruance was a careful, methodical commander who had won the Battle of Midway 2 years earlier through disciplined decision-making rather than aggressive pursuit. His orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters made the protection of the invasion fleet at Saipan the overriding priority. Spruance would not chase the Japanese fleet westward if it meant leaving the transports and support ships at Saipan vulnerable to an end run. This decision would later prove controversial among historians and naval officers who believed Spruance could have destroyed Ozawa's fleet entirely if he had pursued more aggressively. But on June 19th, Spruance's defensive posture placed the most powerful carrier force in history directly in the path of Ozawa's attacking aircraft. The Japanese would come to him, and his fighters would be waiting. The morning of June 19, 1944 dawned clear and warm over the Philippine Sea. Light winds, scattered clouds at high altitude, perfect flying weather, perfect weather for what was to come. On the carriers of Task Force 58, pilots ate breakfast in their wardrooms. Powdered eggs, toast, coffee. Some ate heartily, the nervous energy of anticipation fueling their appetites. Others could barely choke down a bite. They all knew the Japanese fleet was out there somewhere. They all knew contact was imminent. Pilots checked their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, climbing into cockpits still warm from the tropical night. They tested control surfaces, checked ammunition loads, verified that their guns were charged and ready. Ground crews worked alongside them, making last-minute adjustments, wishing the pilots luck with forced cheerfulness. Some pilots wrote letters home, knowing these might be their last words to wives and parents and sweethearts. Others played cards in the ready rooms, killing time until the call came. Some simply sat in silence, watching the horizon turn pink and gold with the rising sun, contemplating what the day might bring. Aboard the carrier Essex, Commander David McCampbell prepared his pilots for whatever was coming. McCampbell was 34 years old, an unusually advanced age for a fighter pilot. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1933. His commission delayed a year by Depression-era budget cuts. He had been a championship diver in college, Eastern Intercollegiate Diving Champion in 1932. His path to becoming a fighter pilot had been anything but straightforward. He had served as a landing signal officer, the man who guides aircraft onto carrier decks with hand signals. He had survived the sinking of the carrier Wasp by Japanese submarine I-19 on September 15, 1942. He had been passed over for combat flying assignments for years, deemed more valuable as an instructor and administrator. When he finally got his chance to form a fighter squadron, he almost failed at the fundamental skill of aerial gunnery. His first qualification attempt produced a score of only 8%, below the minimum of 10% required to pass. The man who would become the greatest Navy ace of the war could not hit a target. McCampbell retrained intensively. He practiced until his skills matched his determination. He formed Fighting Squadron 15 VF-15 on September 1, 1943. Under his leadership, it would become the highest-scoring Navy fighter squadron of the entire war, with 315 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. On the morning of June 19th, McCampbell had only 2 confirmed aerial victories to his name. By sunset, he would have 9. Shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, American radar detected the first Japanese strike wave. The contact was at 150 miles, a mass of aircraft approaching from the west. Lieutenant Joseph Edgerton, the fighter director officer aboard the carrier Lexington, sent out the emergency code. The code was, "Hey Rube." In the old days of American traveling circuses, this phrase was shouted when townspeople attacked circus workers. It meant everyone pile in, every available hand to the fight. Now it meant Japanese aircraft inbound in numbers too large to ignore. Mitcher ordered all bombers sent east to orbit safely away from the coming battle. This cleared the vulnerable hangar decks of armed and fueled aircraft that could explode catastrophically if the carriers were hit. Then he vectored his fighters toward the incoming Japanese formation. More than 220 Hellcats climbed toward the intercept point. They had altitude advantage. They had superior numbers. They had better training and better aircraft. And they knew exactly what to do. The first Japanese wave consisted of 68 aircraft, a mix of Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo planes. They were the best of Ozawa's force, launched from Carrier Division 3, and they made a fatal mistake before the battle even began. Instead of pressing their attack immediately, the Japanese pilots circled at 20,000 feet for 10 minutes to regroup into attack formation. Their leaders wanted a coordinated strike, all aircraft attacking simultaneously for maximum effect. It was textbook tactics, exactly what they had been trained to do. It was also suicide. Those 10 minutes gave the American fighters time to reach optimal intercept position. Those 10 minutes gave radar operators time to refine their tracking. Those 10 minutes let Mitcher vector additional fighters to the threat. By the time the Japanese formation finally turned toward the American fleet, a wall of Hellcats was waiting for them with altitude advantage and energy to burn. The Hellcats fell on them like wolves on sheep. 25 Japanese aircraft went down in the initial intercept. The first pass, 30 seconds of concentrated fire. 25 aircraft tumbling toward the sea, trailing smoke and flame. Pilots burning in their cockpits, wings shearing off, explosions as fuel tanks ignited. The survivors scattered, their formation broken. American pilots picked them off in the chaos that followed. 16 more fell in secondary passes. Aircraft fleeing for home were caught from behind, easy shots for experienced gunners. Aircraft trying to reform were bounced from above, never seeing their killers until the bullets started tearing through their fuselages. Only a handful of the first wave reached the American fleet. Most were shot down by anti-aircraft fire before they could release weapons. One bomb struck the battleship South Dakota, penetrating the main deck and exploding among repair parties working below. 24 sailors were killed. 27 more were wounded. It was the only American ship damaged all day. No Japanese aircraft reached the carriers. The second Japanese wave was larger, between 107 and 128 aircraft. It would suffer even more catastrophically. The second wave launched from Carrier Division 1, Ozawa's best units flying from his flagship Taiho and the veterans on Shokaku and Zuikaku. These were the most experienced pilots in the mobile fleet. They should have performed better than the first wave. They performed worse. 8 aircraft turned back with engine trouble before even approaching the American fleet. Mechanical failures, engine problems, fuel leaks. Some pilots simply lost their nerve and returned to their carriers, claiming equipment malfunctions. They never faced combat. As the remaining formation flew over friendly Japanese ships, the screening vessels misidentified them. Anti-aircraft gunners opened fire on their own aircraft, shooting down 2 and damaging 8 more. The confused, inexperienced pilots could not even signal their identity to their own navy. The formation continued toward the American fleet, now reduced and demoralized before even contacting the enemy. And then the Hellcats found them. Commander David McCampbell spotted a formation of Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers approaching at altitude. These aircraft, known to Americans by the codename Judy, were the fastest dive bombers of World War II. They could reach 343 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to outrun some fighters. They were designed to penetrate defenses that would destroy slower aircraft, but they had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst of .50 caliber fire would destroy them. McCampbell dove on the formation with his wingmen, building speed rapidly as he dropped through the clear Pacific sky. He lined up on the trailing Judy, held his fire until he was close, and pressed the trigger. 6 machine guns roared together. The Judy exploded. McCampbell pulled up, selected another target, and dove again. Another kill. Pull up, dive, kill, pull up. In a matter of minutes, he had splashed 5 enemy dive bombers. He was an ace in a single sortie, a feat that few pilots ever achieve. Nearby, Alex Vasu was having engine trouble, but he was not turning back. Vasu was 25 years old, born in East Chicago, Indiana, to Romanian immigrant parents from Transylvania. He had graduated from DePauw University in 1941 through the civilian pilot training program. He was not a natural pilot. He had to work for every skill he possessed. His career changed when he was selected as wingman by Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first World War II ace and Medal of Honor recipient. Is this conversation helpful so far? Vajo flew O'Hare's wing for 5 months in Fighting Squadron 6, learning tactics and gunnery from the Navy's best. When O'Hare was killed in a night action in November of 1943, Vasu inherited his mentor's aggressive spirit. Now, on June 19th, Vasu's supercharger was stuck in low blower, robbing his engine of power at altitude. Oil was coating his windshield, smearing his vision. His wing-fold lock pins were only partially engaged, making violent maneuvers potentially fatal. And directly ahead of him flew more than 50 Japanese aircraft heading for the fleet. He attacked anyway. Vasu dove on the Judy formation, pressing through his engine troubles, ignoring the oil on his windshield. He got close, point-blank range. He pressed the trigger and held it. The first Judy exploded. He pulled up, selected another target, dove again. In 8 minutes, Alexander Vasu shot down 6 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers. He used only 360 rounds of his 2,400 available ammunition. Each kill averaged roughly 60 bullets. He was so close to his targets that he could see the Japanese pilots' faces. He watched them burn. He later recalled radioing to the other pilots that he did not see how they could possibly shoot them all down. There were too many, and yet they did. Of the original aircraft in the second Japanese wave, 97 were destroyed. Fewer than 20 reached the American fleet. They inflicted no significant damage. They achieved nothing except the deaths of their own pilots and crews. The third wave of 47 aircraft achieved even less. 7 were shot down by American fighters, but most of the pilots in this wave simply failed to find the American fleet at all. Navigation errors sent them wandering over empty ocean. When they could not locate their targets, they turned for home. Mission abandoned. The remnants attacked a small group of American ships detached from the main fleet, causing no damage before retreating. The fourth wave was given incorrect coordinates. Whoever plotted the course made a mathematical error, or the coordinates were garbled in transmission, or someone simply wrote down the wrong numbers. The result was that 82 Japanese aircraft flew to a point in the ocean where no American ships existed. The formations split in confusion. 18 aircraft stumbled upon Rear Admiral Montgomery's task group by accident and attacked. 9 were shot down. The survivors caused no damage. 49 aircraft flew to Guam, intending to land at Orote Field to refuel before attacking the American fleet. They never got the chance. 27 Hellcats intercepted the Japanese formation over the airfield. The Americans had altitude advantage. They had speed. They had the skills that months of intensive training had given them. They fell on the Japanese aircraft as they approached the runway. Wheels down, flaps extended, slow and vulnerable. 30 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in the intercept. The rest managed to land, but their aircraft were so badly damaged that none could fly again. Orote Field became a graveyard of broken machines. But the disaster for Japan was not limited to the air. Beneath the waves, American submarines were hunting. The submarine Albacore, under Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, was patrolling west of the battle area when her sonar operator detected propeller sounds. Blanchard brought Albacore to periscope depth and spotted what every submarine commander submarine Albacore dreamed of finding: a Japanese fleet carrier. The target was Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. Taiho was Japan's newest and largest carrier, commissioned only 3 months earlier in March of 1944. She was designed to be the most survivable carrier in the world. An armored flight deck, 3.5 inches of steel, could withstand bomb hits that would destroy other carriers. Extensive internal compartmentalization limited flooding damage. Duplicate systems provided redundancy for critical functions. At 8:10 in the morning, Blanchard lined up Albacore for a torpedo attack. He fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the massive target. Japanese lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes. Taiho's captain ordered an emergency turn. 5 torpedoes missed, but 1 struck the starboard side near the forward aviation fuel tanks. The damage seemed manageable at first. The torpedo had ruptured fuel storage compartments and jammed the forward aircraft elevator. Serious but not fatal. Taiho could still steam. She could still operate aircraft from her deck. The damage control teams went to work, but aviation fuel was leaking into the lower compartments, pooling in bilges, seeping through ventilation shafts. The volatile Borneo crude oil produced naphtha vapors that collected in every enclosed space. The ship began to smell of gasoline. An inexperienced damage control officer, trying to clear the fumes, made a catastrophic decision. He ordered all ventilation systems to maximum. In theory, this would blow the dangerous vapors out of the ship. In practice, it spread them throughout every compartment, creating a cloud of explosive gas that filled the entire hull. For 6 hours, Taiho steamed on, her crew unaware that they were working inside a bomb. At 2:32 in the afternoon, a spark from an electric motor in the lower decks found the accumulated vapors. The explosion was massive. Multiple secondary explosions followed as fuel stores and ammunition ignited. The armored flight deck designed to withstand bomb hits buckled upward from the internal pressure. The hull split open along the seams. Fires erupted everywhere. Men were blown overboard. Men were incinerated at their stations. Men drowned as compartments flooded. Taiho sank rapidly, taking 1,650 of her 2,150 crew with her. Among the dead was most of the ship's aviation staff, the experienced pilots and mechanics who had prepared the aircraft. Ozawa transferred his flag to a destroyer, then to the carrier Zuikaku, struggling to maintain command of a fleet that was falling apart around him. Meanwhile, the submarine Kavala was having an even more successful patrol. Kavala, under Lieutenant Commander Hermann Kostler, was on her first war patrol, her maiden voyage as a combat vessel. Her crew was inexperienced but eager. Her commander had never fired a torpedo in anger. At 11:18 in the morning, Kostler raised his periscope and spotted another carrier. This was Shokaku, one of the most famous ships in the Japanese Navy. Shokaku had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. She had fought at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. She was a veteran of every major carrier battle of the Pacific War. Kostler brought Kavala into attack position. He fired 3 torpedoes. All 3 hit. The explosions ruptured aviation fuel tanks throughout Shokaku's hull. Fires erupted almost immediately, spreading through hangar decks filled with armed aircraft. The damage control teams tried to contain the flames, but the fires reached the forward magazine. The explosion that followed broke the ship in half. The forward section and the aft section separated, each sinking independently. Men were thrown into the water. Men were trapped below decks as the ship went down. Men burned to death in fuel fires that spread across the water's surface. Shokaku sank with 1,263 of her crew. 570 survived, plucked from the oil-covered water by Japanese destroyers. By sunset on June 19, the Japanese had lost more than 350 aircraft and 2 fleet carriers. Nearly 3,000 men were dead or dying. American losses were fewer than 30 aircraft and around 109 killed. It was the most lopsided carrier battle in history. The kill ratio exceeded 12-1, and it had a name that captured perfectly its one-sided nature. That evening, aboard the carrier Lexington, pilots gathered in the ready rooms to debrief. They were exhausted but elated. Many had scored multiple kills. Some had faced death and survived through skill and luck. All knew they had participated in something extraordinary. Lieutenant Junior Grade Zeke Cormier, a VF-16 pilot from Missouri, had grown up hunting in the Ozark Hills. He knew what it looked like when hunters had every advantage over their prey. He had scored 4 victories himself that day, and he summed up what they had all experienced in a single phrase. "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot," he said. In rural America, a turkey shoot was a competition where hunters shot at turkeys that returned one by one to a feeding station. Easy targets, predictable targets, almost unsporting. The metaphor captured perfectly what had happened in the skies over the Philippine Sea. The phrase spread rapidly. Officers repeated it in their reports. Pilots told it to each other. By morning, the entire fleet was calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the battle was not over. Ozawa had lost 2 carriers and most of his aircraft, but he did not know the full extent of the disaster. Communications had broken down. Reports were confused. He believed incorrectly that many of his aircraft had survived and were waiting on Guam. He believed Kakuta's land-based aircraft were still operational and ready to support another attack. He ordered his remaining carriers to withdraw and regroup for a renewed offensive. Mitcher wanted to pursue. His pilots had destroyed an enemy air force in a single day. If he could find the Japanese carriers and strike them, he could destroy the entire mobile fleet. But Admiral Spruance held him back, refusing to leave the Saipan invasion force unprotected. The Japanese might be trying to draw the carriers west while another force attacked the transports. Spruance would not take that risk. American search aircraft scoured the seas for the retreating Japanese fleet throughout the morning and early afternoon of June 20th. Hour after hour, scout planes flew expanding search patterns, looking for the telltale silhouettes of carriers and battleships. At 3:40 in the afternoon, scout planes finally located Ozawa. The Japanese fleet was 275 miles away, near the extreme limit of strike range for the aircraft aboard Task Force 58. Then a corrected position report added 60 more miles. The enemy was over 300 miles away. The math was brutal. Launching a strike at this range would consume most of the attacking aircraft's fuel on the outbound flight. They would have minutes over the target, not the prolonged attack they preferred. Then they would face a long return flight, arriving after sunset. Recovery would occur in darkness on a moonless night by pilots who had never practiced night carrier landings. Many aircraft would run out of fuel over the open ocean. Pilots would crash trying to land on darkened flight decks. Some would simply disappear into the night, never to be found. Men would die not from enemy action but from the simple, brutal arithmetic of fuel consumption. Mitchell understood all of this. He also understood that he might never get another chance to destroy the Japanese carrier fleet. He gave the order, "Get the carriers." 240 aircraft launched into the late afternoon sky. Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers. They formed up over the fleet and headed west, climbing to cruising altitude, watching their fuel gauges drop with every passing minute. Many pilots believed they were saying goodbye. The strike force arrived over the Japanese fleet at sunset. The sky was painted orange and red, the sun dropping toward the western horizon, the ocean turning dark beneath them. Only about 35 Japanese fighters rose to intercept. The combat was brief and one-sided. American aircraft sank the carrier Hyo, putting torpedoes and bombs into her hull until she rolled over and went down with 250 of her crew. They damaged carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda. They hit the battleship Haruna. They sank 2 oilers that would have refueled the retreating fleet. 20 American aircraft were lost to enemy action over the Japanese fleet. But the real crisis came after the attack was over. The strike aircraft turned for home as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Ahead of them lay 300 miles of open ocean. Behind them, darkness was falling. Their fuel gauges showed reserve levels that would not last the flight. Pilots watched their gauges drop. They leaned their fuel mixtures to the extreme, trading engine performance for range. They descended to lower altitudes where the engines burned less fuel. Some jettisoned empty drop tanks and excess weight. Some said prayers. The first aircraft began running out of fuel while still miles from the fleet. Pilots ditched into the dark water, struggling out of sinking cockpits, inflating life rafts, hoping someone would find them before morning. Others pressed on, engines coughing as fuel tanks ran dry. By the time the first aircraft reached Task Force 58, the fleet was invisible. No lights, no beacons. Standard blackout doctrine kept the ships dark to avoid submarine attack. Pilots circled in the darkness, desperately searching for their carriers, burning the last of their fuel. Rear Admiral Jocko Clark of the carrier Hornet made a decision. He ordered his ship illuminated, running lights, flight deck floods. Every light that could be turned on was switched on. Clark understood the risk. Japanese submarines might see the lights and attack, but his pilots would die if they could not find the deck. Admiral Mitchell backed the decision. He ordered every ship in Task Force 58 to turn on all lights. Running lights blazed from stem to stern on every vessel. Flight deck floods illuminated landing areas. Searchlights pointed straight up at the sky, creating columns of light that pilots could see from miles away. Destroyers fired star shells, the pyrotechnics bursting overhead and drifting down on parachutes, bathing the sea in artificial daylight. "Turn on the lights," Mitchell ordered. It violated every rule of wartime blackout doctrine. It invited submarine attack, could cost ships and lives. But Mitchell chose his pilots over his ships. Despite the illumination, the night was a disaster. Aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched into the black water just short of the carriers. Others crashed on flight decks in the confusion, missing arresting wires, skidding into parked aircraft, falling over the side. Some pilots, disoriented and exhausted, landed on the wrong carriers. Some landed on battleships that had no facilities for recovering aircraft. 80 aircraft were lost that night, not to enemy action but to empty fuel tanks and darkness. But the rescue operation that followed was extraordinary. Destroyers spread out at first light, searching the ocean for life rafts and floating debris. Float planes launched from cruisers, landing alongside survivors and taxiing them back to the fleet. Every pilot who made it into a raft was searched for. No one was written off without exhaustive effort. In the end, Only 16 pilots and 33 crewmen were lost from the strike. Most had been pulled from the water by determined rescuers who refused to give up. The mission Beyond Darkness, as it came to be called, had cost aircraft but saved men. The final accounting of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was devastating for Japan. 3 carriers sunk, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hayo. 2 oilers lost, 6 other ships damaged, including 3 carriers and a battleship. Between 550 and 650 aircraft destroyed, nearly 3,000 personnel killed, including approximately 445 trained aviators. American losses were minimal by comparison. No ship sunk, 1 battleship slightly damaged. Approximately 123 to 130 aircraft lost, most to operational causes during the night recovery. Around 109 personnel killed, including roughly 76 aviators. Ozawa's surviving carriers limped back to Japan with only 35 operational aircraft between them. From an original complement of approximately 450 carrier aircraft, fewer than 1 in 10 remained. Japan's carrier aviation had been destroyed in 2 days. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again attempt conventional carrier warfare against the United States. The aftermath reshaped the Pacific War. With Japanese naval aviation neutralized, the Mariana Islands fell in sequence. Saipan was secured by July 9, 1944. Tinian fell by August 1. Guam was retaken by August 10. On these islands, American engineers constructed the massive airfields that would host the B-29 strategic bombing campaign. The bombers came. They burned Japanese cities to ash. Incendiary raids turned Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities into infernos. The bombs that would eventually fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were loaded onto B-29s at Tinian's North Field, made possible by the victory at the Philippine Sea. The fall of Saipan triggered a political crisis in Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his entire cabinet resigned. Even the Japanese leadership could no longer pretend that victory was possible. The question now was how the war would end, not whether Japan would win. The destruction of conventional carrier aviation drove Japan toward a terrible new strategy. Captain Motoharu Okamura had begun investigating organized suicide attacks as early as June 15, 1944. By October, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines with only 30 operational aircraft. He recognized that conventional attacks were futile. Japan could no longer train pilots to adequate standards for normal combat. The solution was one-way missions requiring minimal training. Point the aircraft at the enemy ship, dive into the deck, die for the Emperor. The kamikaze was born directly from the ashes of the Marianas Turkey Shoot. For months after the Philippine Sea, on October 24, 1944, Commander David McCampbell demonstrated what a fully trained pilot could achieve. McCampbell was not supposed to fly that day. Admiral Sherman had forbidden it, deeming the Navy's leading ace too valuable to risk. But when the alert sounded and the order came for all available fighter pilots to man their planes, McCampbell decided he qualified as available. His Hellcat was only partially fueled before being waved off the deck. The situation was desperate. Japanese land-based aircraft were attacking in waves of 50 to 60 planes each, and every fighter was needed. McCampbell led 7 Hellcats toward the incoming Japanese strike. He directed 5 of them to intercept the bombers while he and his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Roy Rushing, climbed to engage the fighter escort alone. 2 aircraft against 40 to 60 Japanese fighters. For roughly 90 minutes, McCampbell and Rushing executed approximately 20 coordinated diving attacks against the Japanese formation. They used energy tactics, the same techniques they had practiced countless times. Dive to fire, zoom back to altitude, dive again. Never let the enemy engage on equal terms. McCampbell shot down 9 confirmed aircraft. Rushing shot down 6 with 2 probables. Their combined 15 aerial victories in a single sortie remains an unmatched record in American combat aviation. Rushing exhausted his ammunition first. He radioed to McCampbell that he was out of bullets. McCampbell asked if he wanted to return to the fleet or stay up and watch the show. Rushing stayed with him for 2 more passes without firing a shot, guarding his squadron commander's tail with an empty aircraft. When they finally turned for home, both pilots were fired upon by friendly ships that mistook them for Japanese aircraft. McCampbell landed on the carrier Langley because Essex's deck was fouled. His engine died on the arresting wire. He was completely out of fuel. He had only 6 rounds of ammunition remaining in one gun. For his actions across both battles, David McCampbell received the Medal of Honor. He finished the war with 34 confirmed aerial victories, the United States Navy's all-time leading ace, the 3rd highest-scoring American ace of the Second World War. He was the highest-scoring American ace to survive the war. He retired as a captain in 1964. He died in 1996 in West Palm Beach, Florida, and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The guided missile destroyer USS McCampbell bears his name. Alexander Vasu returned to combat after the Philippine Sea. On December 14, 1944, he was shot down by anti-aircraft fire over the Philippines. He parachuted safely and was rescued by Filipino guerrillas. Vasu spent 5 weeks behind enemy lines. He was appointed brevet major and commanded a guerrilla unit fighting Japanese patrols. When he finally reached American forces, he returned to flying and finished the war with 19 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, Vasu became a test pilot. He won the Navy Individual Gunnery Championship in 1957. He retired as a commander in 1963 and lived quietly in California until his death on January 29, 2015, at the age of 96. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the last carrier versus carrier battle in history. It was the final time the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted conventional carrier aviation against the United States. The destruction was irreversible. Japan could not replace the aviators killed. Its training system could not produce competent pilots fast enough to matter. The F6F Hellcat had proven itself beyond any doubt. The pilots who flew it had demonstrated skill and courage that their enemies could not match. The battle ensured that the war would end with American victory. 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, nearly 3,000 Japanese dead. American losses minimal. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot earned its name. The men who flew that day, who dove into formations of enemy aircraft, who pressed attacks through anti-aircraft fire, who landed on darkened carrier decks after midnight, won one of the most decisive victories in naval history. They earned that victory with blood, skill, and courage. They deserved every word written about them.